Since I reviewed iFi's Pro iDSD DAC and headphone amp, people have been clamoring for a less complex and less expensive version with just as good sound. So iFi came up with this. This is the Neo iDSD DAC and headphone amp, and as well as being considerably less expensive, it has a couple of interesting and unique features. First of all, it is primarily USB powered, and it also has a desktop mounting stand, so you can actually mount it vertically on your desk and use it this way. So I'm going to take you through the features and show you how this works, and then I'm going to give you my impressions of how it sounded with a variety of headphones as well as used as a dedicated DAC with other headphone amps. Now, the iDSD Neo certainly looks the part. It's very shiny and has this very cool looking relief here, which I have to say in the morning sun does look very attractive. But I think more the functionality is probably more of everyone's interest. And so let's start with my favorite place on any device is the back, because it tells you everything you need to know pretty much about the functionality for the most part, although some digital components of course have other features built in. So on the back it looks fairly conventional. You have your digital inputs here, you have your power and you have your Bluetooth, and then your analog outputs, the single-ended RCA jacks and the two 3-pin XLR jacks. Now the inputs things get a little bit interesting. Now the power is DC 5 volts and 2.5 amps. Does that sound familiar? 5 volts is the power over USB, the standard power delivery over USB, although of course in modern devices for charging there are different power levels, but it's a kind of standard USB output power from a computer. Now, that also, as I said in the introduction, it can be USB powered. Now it comes with iFi's own iPower supply, but you can also just power it directly off the USB, although you probably wouldn't want to do that, especially if you're just plugging it directly into a computer, as computers tend to dump various degrees of noise down the USB lines, and they can kind of interfere in the the performance of something like this, and the power delivery may not be consistent too. But I actually have a iFi's own iUSB as well, which is a high quality, kind of like a USB hub with a high quality power supply built in. Actually, you can see the cable coming from it. It's actually under my desk here, and you can see it go where I had the Neo iDSD sitting up here, and I was actually powering it off that to experiment what the sound was like with different kind of power inputs, and I'll talk about that in the sound itself. But that means you may notice that the USB input actually is a USB 3 input. Now it's not actually a USB 3 connection. They put that there so you can use the better shielded USB 3 cables for, well, potentially less noise getting into the device. And as you see, if you're wondering why this cable was hooked up here, it's because I also have the iDSD signature in here, which I was powering using the USB extension cable, and I found it just convenient just to use that as it was. But anyway, that means there is a little bit of potential for improving the sound quality of the iDSD Neo with maybe a better quality power supply, either through the included port here or through the USB input here, and I'll talk about that in the sound. Other inputs are fairly conventional. You have your Sony Philips digital interface, SPDIF, and that through here, and it uses, confusingly for some people, an RCA plug. It's not the same RCA as this. You do need a 75 ohm cable ideally. You can use any RCA cable, but it's not a good idea, as due to the characteristic impedance, if it's off, you'll get signal reflections, and it could cause issues with kind of the reliability of getting the digital signal through, or you could end up having some, maybe some as the DAC tries to correct for the errors, it may generate noise itself. There could be some issues there. Anyway, you also have optical digital, which is good for noise isolation from a computer, but the disadvantage is getting a reliable high-res connection. If you are interested in, say, 192K high res, it can be troublesome. Now, even with a good cable from somewhere like SysConcepts or AudioQuest or Vandenhull and that, I've had some trouble even getting a reliable 192K with some devices over optical. Actually, a really funny story I just heard was that someone tried an Amazon Basics in place of their expensive AudioQuest cable and actually got a better result, which is kind of odd, as those cheap cables tend to have much higher jitter. But who knows what's going on? The optical can be good for some people and not less good for others. So it's something that's kind of a little bit complex in itself. Now, of course, you have your analog outputs here. Now, I don't imagine people will necessarily buy this to use as a DAC, although you can, because it's kind of half-half. Half it's kind of electronics go into being a DAC and the other half go into being a headphone amp. And the headphone amp is where things get a little bit interesting. It's primarily a balanced headphone amp, so you should use this 4.4mm Pentagon connector if you do use it with headphones. Now the 4.4mm connector is a newish connector. It's designed, well, I hope it will replace all the myriad of balanced connectors that have been appeared over the years, 2.5mm, dual 3-pin XLR, 4-pin XLR, which is kind of closest to the current standard. And headphone manufacturers, especially high-end ones, are starting to provide this 4.4mm connector, which was designed by Sony engineers. And this setup that we have here with the 4.4mm balance and the 6.3mm 1/4-inch unbalanced connection is kind of my ideal combination for a DAC like this. So it gets my approval for this particular combination here, as this is the way I think everything should go in the future with these two connectors. The only disadvantage to this setup in the Neo iDSD is that full power to the headphones comes out of only the 4.4mm connector. You actually only get a few hundred milliwatts out of the 6.3mm connector, which is fine for in-ear monitors. If you don't listen loud, would be fine for headphones. But if you do start turning the volume up, say with big planar headphones like the ones I have floating around here, or high-end headphones, then you're going to notice fairly quickly that it's kind of lacking in power, and you're going to want to use the 4.4mm connector ideally. Other than that, you just have your power connector here and your input selector, because everything generally is managed through this neat little remote control, which has your brightness setting, so you can turn the brightness down on the display. It has a mute button, and it has volume up and down, and input selector as well, basic kind of plastic remote control. So that's kind of the overview of the functionality of the Neo iDSD. The only thing I've missed out so far is on the inputs is the Bluetooth, which has everything in the kitchen sink, including the new Huawei Bluetooth audio, which I tried to get working and unfortunately couldn't. I tried getting it working from a FIO device and it didn't, but otherwise the Bluetooth, it works, and it definitely passed over LDAC. And so, well, other than that, let's talk about my impressions of how listening to music with this was. As far as driving headphones goes, for a USB powered DAC amp, the iDSD Neo did a pretty good job. You can see I've actually been driving the HC6XX most recently through an adapter through the 4.4mm port. I also have here the final D8000 Pros, which were, for the sake of this video, are going to be my example of planar headphones, although I did put a variety of headphones with the iDSD Neo to see how it performed. Now, before we get into the full-sized headphone drive, I did do what I call the hiss test. And the hiss test is where I take a pair of very sensitive in-ear monitors, which is the Campfire Audio Andrometers, and I plug them in and I listen for hiss, basically. The good news, no hiss. The bad news, a very strong high-pitched whine. Now, I unplugged everything except the iPower or except just a USB power supply to see if it was caused by anything that I'd plugged in, and it wasn't. Unfortunately, it was coming from the device itself. So with something like Andrometers, it would be a showstopper. With maybe other in-ear monitors, I did try other pairs. You could just hear the whine because the in-ear monitors were less sensitive, and maybe with music playing, you probably wouldn't notice at all. But for people who are super sensitive to any kind of hiss or whine or anything like that, would find it a showstopper all the same. So I can say there it didn't quite pass as I'd hoped it would. Now, but back onto full-sized headphones, that's where things got a little bit more interesting. Now, if you want a kind of quick summary of the overall sound with the iDSD Neo, it's not like the portable iFi products. I've got the iDSD Signature in here for a review, for example, which is kind of a slightly warmer, punchier sound. The iDSD Neo had a more open, kind of clear, lighter sound overall. Now, being that it was lighter, I was thinking, well, is this a case of a bit of a lack of power supply again? Because the bass punch with planar headphones, like these D8000s, wasn't as strong as I was hoping. And I thought, well, is it just my perception of things? So I decided to set up a second rig. Actually, I've got 2 extra rigs to compare it with. The first is this SMSL SU9, which I've reviewed before, and also another product I've reviewed before, which is Drop's THX AAA 789. Combine those up to make another rig, maybe a little bit cheaper than the iDSD Neo is overall, but it was interesting to compare. Normally I find the THX amps to be really kind of open and clear as a good description, but I found that the bass with these was kind of more meaty sounding, and the overall soundstage kind of more open and wide with that particular combination than with the iDSD Neo. Now, an interesting thing about the iDSD Neo is it uses iFi's GTO, or Gibbs Transient Optimized Digital Filter. Now, I noticed when I had the iDSD Pro in here, where you could switch the filters around, is that different filters gave you a different perception of the sound. Now, for something like a Chord DAC, which has a very high tap, very heavily computed digital filter, it gives the most deep and the most, I wouldn't say the most wide, because width of soundstage very much depends on the headphones more than anything, but it gave the most sense of accurate depth. Now, the iFi filter, on the other hand, brought everything very forward. Now, this can be good or bad. With the Chord filters, you'd have everything very deep behind the speakers, and that gave the kind of effect of sometimes being a little bit less kind of exciting to listen with. Now, with the GTO filter, it brings everything forward and in your face, and especially with some headphones, I found it very kind of more entertaining to listen to. Now, this is what the iDSD Neo has in it, and it did bring the kind of sound very forward, and you did kind of feel like the upper mids, or the mids in general, had more of a presence, and probably partially because the bass seemed to have less presence with full-size planar headphones. Now, with the HD6XX, this was a little bit different. Now, out of the SMSL and drop rig, it kind of sounded a little bit kind of dull, especially after switching between headphones. They do sound a little bit kind of rolled off on the top end, and that's not quite so good. However, out of the iDSD Neo, that top end was brought out a little bit better, and actually found it to be a better combination overall. So maybe the kind of headphones you have, and the kind of synergy you want to have with your headphones may be critical in whether you choose to buy something like the iDSD Neo, as I did like it better with the HD6XX, for example, and maybe less so in comparison to the other rigs I have here with planar headphones. Now, if you're wondering, well, you can spend a couple of $100 more than the iDSD Neo and get something like the Bifrost Jotunheim rig, and I've got the new Jotunheim 2 in for review. So, a bit of a hint to subscribe to notify when that's going to be reviewed soon. Now, this kind of rig is a very old school sounding rig, very kind of, your old school paper cone speaker, kind of thick, meaty kind of sound, less wide open. The Bifrost, especially while it has maybe a better sense of depth, isn't quite so wide sounding as some DACs are, maybe like some of the things like the Topping D90, or especially the Yggdrasil. So in that, this is a kind of very thick and meaty sounding rig, but the other thing to consider is that this is a lot to do with the Bifrost itself. Now, if you're wondering, well, what about the iDSD Neo as a DAC? So I did plug it into the Master 9 to compare with other DACs and DAC amps, so I can easily hook up 2 or 3 at a time and compare them, and even do so volume matched. And in that, well, I reckon that the iDSD Neo is more like a $500 amp and a $500 DAC combined in one box. As far as DACs go, it was kind of fairly comparable to the SU9 in that sense of music being more forward in your face was more present with the iDSD Neo, whereas the SU9 had that kind of Saber DAC quality of being kind of more feeling like it was more extended in the bass and maybe a little bit more extended in the treble. It kind of had a bit more presence to the music. So some of that could come down to the digital filter, especially as the SU9, you can adjust all the things like digital filters and add in sound color, which adds in a little bit of kind of euphonic distortion in there to make things sound a little bit more pleasant. So there is some variability there, but the main thing was to try and get an understanding of the character of the iDSD Neo. And in that, well, again, like I said at the beginning, it's got that kind of more open, lighter, kind of more mid and upper mid focused sound. So at $1,000, well, it was challenged by a lot of gear, and at $1,000 mark, it's kind of in an area where there's a lot to compete with, especially considering that you can make some great DAC amp combinations of using separate components, separate DAC and separate amp, just as I have here, and which could come out a little bit cheaper. So in that, well, still, if you do want to combine DAC amp, just one thing, especially with this vertical stand, and you do want that kind of open and lighter and clearer sound from a DAC amp, that's your preferred sound or your preferred synergy for the gear you're using, then you might find the iDSD Neo particularly appealing. So that's the iDSD Neo. Before you go, don't forget these videos are supported by patrons, people just such as yourself, who, like as I always say, for the equivalent of buying me a coffee once in a while, help me make these videos. I also get to see these videos before anyone else does, get to ask me questions directly and chat with me anytime, actually even daily sometimes. Some people even just sign up and ask me questions immediately, and this could save you a lot of money so that you're ensuring that you don't buy the wrong thing for your musical tastes. So consider becoming a patron and help me make these videos. So thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.